So can we start with some basic information? So your name, your date of birth, and your place of birth, please.
Right. My name's Michael Kelly, known as Mike to most people. I was born in Hull in East Yorkshire in November 1946, and I went to Warwick University as a student. I think the story starts really in Warwick because I did a degree in French studies there. It's very exciting. It was the first year of the university's existence, and so I got used to the kind of pioneering and making do with all sorts of chaos approach. So as part of my French studies degree, I had the option of spending a year abroad in France. It wasn't compulsory, but I took the option. That was October 1967. So I fetched up in France, in the fine city of Caen, in late September 1967. And that's really where the story begins. My own background was very much literary and philosophical, and not very political to any great degree. So I was really interested in the cultural life of Caen and the things like the theatre and concerts. And of course, I was there as a lecteur or an assistant in the École Normale des Garçons, which is in the unbombed suburbs of Caen. And I was lodged in the school, so a lot of my experience of that year is refracted through where I was, who I met on a routine day-to-day basis. Most of the broader context of Caen was new, and I was there in mode of discovery and interested in see what was going on. The first couple of weeks was kind of a nice autumn period, and I do remember one day going into the centre of the city and seeing hundreds upon hundreds of elderly men in berets. Well, they seemed elderly to me, really. I was 20 at the time. And I thought, that's interesting. It's some sort of farm show or something. But no, it was a manifestation des paysans. They were there complaining about some aspects of the European Common Agricultural Policy, I think. Not that I was particularly interested in the detail of that, but it kind of gave me a taste for the difference of being in a city where you could have probably several thousand people swarming about and making some kind of protest, and well, that's the way France is. That was kind of my introduction to the year. So later on, the events that followed seemed to be in a reasonable logical progression from what I'd started out seeing.
And before we get into what happened during the events, prior to you going to Caen, had you been to France before?
I'd been to France before, yes. I'd spent part of a summer in France as part of a school exchange arrangement. And yeah, I'd spent 3 weeks on a farm in the Ile-de-France at that stage. And during the first summer of my degree, we had to go and spend a period of time of study in France. So I spent the thick end of a month in Grenoble, doing cours de civilisation, French for foreign students, and having a general good time. So that was my experience of France. So summer of '66, And I didn't go again then till summer of 67 or autumn of 67.
And you mentioned earlier that you had more of an interest in the cultural aspects of France than the political aspects. But during your time in the UK or in England as a student in the UK, had you become involved in any political militancy, anything? Were you politicized, I suppose, is the question.
I was not strongly politicized, but I certainly went on demonstrations, on anti-apartheid demonstrations, and CND demonstrations. I was interested in the CND, and I guess one of my cultural interests was the folk movement, which was then really quite prominent in Britain, and the ethos of that was pretty left wing. Some of my friends were active in the Labour Party, and I went along to a few meetings, and I certainly remember a meeting in Coventry with Connie Ziliakis. I had no idea who this chap might have been, but he was obviously a very distinguished old left-winger. And I guess the broad ethos of circles I moved in was of the left, but the broad left, I guess, rather than the far left. So I arrived in France sympathetic to a broadly left programme. This was a time, I mean, in Britain, we were into the Labour governments under Harold Wilson. And I guess some of my politicisation would be going to satirical shows, Beyond the Fringe, reading satirical magazines like Private Eye, that sort of thing. So I guess, that seemed a very comfortable place to be in the context of being a student in Britain, or indeed in France, at that period.
So when you arrived in Caen in September 67, what are your initial impressions? Do you find it a very different setup to back home?
Yes. Different in a lot of ways. One of the things I did was to sign on for a university course, and well, it took me about 3 months to finally be registered, between getting residence permits and registering for courses, getting into the Students' Union, handing over what seemed like dozens of passport photographs for this, that, and the other kind of card. So it seemed very, very administrative, very bureaucratic. And I spent a lot of time in queues and being sent from one guichet to another to get a stamp on whatever piece of paper it was. But I quite enjoyed the limited student life. Obviously, I had to do my 12 hours a week of teaching in the École Normale, and then I went to lectures. I'd signed on for I think it was a second year, suite of second year courses, and I went to as many as I could, and I enjoyed them. They were mainly literary, philosophical, but some really interesting things. I discovered Nietzsche there and Dostoevsky, and I didn't discover Dostoevsky. I'd already got to Dostoevsky at that stage. And there was a kind of radical tinge, but radical with quite a small r and not a very political one. The university itself, unlike British universities, was a pretty big impersonal place, and there didn't seem to be a lot of focus to student life. There were cafes and bars, but most students kind of went into their classes and then either went back home or went into the town and sat in a cafe somewhere. Whereas my experience at Warwick for 2 years had been very much of a campus university. Now, part of the time, clearly, I lived outside the campus, but part of the time inside it. And in British universities at that stage, a lot of the cultural life really did circulate around the university. I guess it still does. And that was really quite a difference. There was a club, an English club, which a lot of the students went to, and I was encouraged to go along because I was English and could speak English. And there were a few other kind of organisations, but as a foreign student, it takes quite a while to get into these sorts of activities and to establish your credentials. I mean, I think I was a bit of a strange beast to a lot of people, and they weren't quite sure what to do with me, but for the most part were sort of welcoming and reasonably inclusive. There were a number of other English students in the town, not very many, I'd say about 5 or 6, and I occasionally bumped into them at the university, though I didn't see a lot of them, saw them from time to time, but I was basically there to do the French thing.
And so in those initial few months, before things really kick off, in 1968, was there any sign that something wasn't right? Was there any sense that there was tension in the air? Or?
There was not a lot of sign. I guess there was a certain amount of huffing and puffing about the lack of social facilities, which of course became quite a key issue subsequently. But most people kind of got on with things. And well, when you're, I mean, in that position, 20-year-old student, I didn't have a strong sense of what was normal in France. And, you know, students griping about the lack of sports facilities or other things seemed to be part of life, really, rather than anything particularly distinctive. Certainly, there was no sense of kind of a build-up or brooding in those early times. I guess, I mean, I took a sort of countercultural culture to be a given, really. I mean, I spent quite a bit of time in the theatre, the Maison de la Culture in Caen, which was quite a progressive, left-leaning sort of place with avant-garde culture, you know, hot jazz and cool jazz and Aimé Césaire playing Une Saison au Congo, his playing. So there was that quite comfortable sort of left opposition. And of course, there was a lot of looking down the nose at Le Père de Gaulle, who most people were fairly irritated by, I guess. I didn't really come across any de Gaulle supporters, but most people I knew kind of accepted that there was this old buffer in charge of the country and that we didn't much like it, but that was the way life was. So I think that's how I would see it. And of course, I was sort of semi-detached as a student, since I was only there part of the time, and I often had to get back to give my English classes in the school. So I certainly wasn't involved in student politics in a way that I would have been in Warwick. I mean, in Warwick, I generally went along to students' union meetings and chipped in when I thought I had something to say. In France, it was a little bit different. And I think I was more in observer mode. I certainly didn't go along to any meetings, but then I wasn't a member of any of the students' unions. It never occurred to me that I should be, really. I was a member of the the British National Union of Students, and didn't seek membership of anything else. I'm not sure it would have been given to me anyway.
Yeah.
So yes.
How do things kick off then? How do you find yourself involved? And what were your experiences then once things kicked off in Caen?
Right, once things kicked off, well, I mean, they took a while to kick off. I mentioned the peasants' demonstration. Then in the new year, in the kind of January, February time, there were a series of strikes, quite big, serious strikes in Caen, with the big motor manufacturers, Saviem in particular, and a lot of other workers involved. And of course, there were demonstrations and confrontations with the police. People were beaten. Tear gas was in the air, and kind of from January onwards, I got used to being in town and sniffing a little bit of tear gas in the air. I wasn't involved in those demonstrations. I mean, they didn't seem to concern me particularly, but I certainly read about them in the newspapers. I remember Canard Enchaîné had a front headline about Trique à la mode de Caen at one stage, with cartoons of CRS beating workers and so on. In terms of the students' union and the student activity, the École Normale where I was, as used to be the French system, was 3 years, what we would call fifth and sixth form, followed by a year's postgraduate work, during which students would get their teaching qualification. The ethos of the school was very educational. The École Normale system was one which required students to enter a competition, and for the 4 years that they were in the école, they were essentially fonctionnaires. They were paid for by the state, who looked after every part of their education. The school was a boarding school, and lots of the students were from all over Normandy, or at least all over Calvados. So they weren't typical of the students that you would see in the fac. But there were grumblings during January and February, but I think some of the students got involved in the workers' demonstrations, and there was a visit from the Minister of Education at the time, Alain Perfit, where he was chahuté by the students at that stage. But that didn't really amount to very much, I don't think. There was a bit more activity, well, I guess there wasn't much before Easter, really. So it's when I got back from the Easter break that things were starting to kick off. And really, I guess, beginning of May, there were student demonstrations and then eventually an occupation. And there was a good deal of linking up between the students and the workers at that point, I know. So I can't say it came out of the blue, but then, I was a foreigner in a foreign country, and this seemed to me the way they do things in France, really. So I was interested and indeed fascinated. But within the school, École Normale, the only real activity came from the first years, who would be fifth formers, if you like. And they began protesting about le bizutage, the kind of initiation pranks and general brimade of first-year students. Naturally enough, most of the people I talked to were either staff or the surveillant, the peon, who looked after the boarding side of the school, or the senior students who were kind of my age, really. They, on the whole, were not very sympathetic to the les bisous kicking up a fuss about the way they were treated. But I did have classes with the deuxième students, and a lot of discussions with them about how they saw the way they were treated as being part of a wider pattern. They were becoming really quite conscious of the very authoritarian ways that France was accustomed to. They didn't like the physical harshness, and they told me stories about the way they were treated by their parents and so on, kind of routine disciplining, and the martinet figured quite a bit, the whip that a lot of French families had hanging on the door to beat their kids if they misbehaved. So I think there was a lot of resistance to that general authoritarianism, and certainly the more active of those first-year students went out on demonstrations. Though certainly at one stage they spontaneously organised to go and join one of the bigger student demonstrations in the centre of the city, much to the amazement of everybody else in the school and disapproval, of course, but they weren't stopped. And I guess they linked up with other lycéens from the town. So they were very excited about what was happening. I think they didn't have a sense of the events that were taking place so much as a sense of where they fitted into the culture, and they knew whose side they were on, and that the protests against de Gaulle and against the government and so on were of a piece with their unhappiness with their subordinate status in the school society.
What was how did you experience? What was your role both in the school and in the university?
I think, in retrospect, I'd say I was something of an observer participant. I was nobody was quite sure where I fitted in, really. I mean, I clearly wasn't a teacher, although I had contact with the English teachers in the school. And one of them was very friendly, the other one was quite hostile because I didn't speak the sort of English that she taught. My main day-to-day contacts, in fact, were with the peon, the surveillant, who mostly were graduate students working in the school to pay their way through their studies. I saw some of the school administration in the dining room, and they were quite divided about it. I was quite interested that one of the school staff was an Algerian whose surname was, whose name was Xavier Gillois, but everybody made it. So they used to call him Ali, and made it clear that Xavier Gillois was his French name and that he had a different name in Arabic. I don't know retrospectively whether he was from an Arki background, but he had a strong attachment to de Gaulle and would speak up for Monsieur le Président. I think most of the rest of the school were more kind of socialist leaning, and they would probably look to people like Mitterrand. Not many were in the Communist Party, as far as I'm aware. And I don't think, well, I didn't know of anybody who was in any of the far left groups, of which, of course, there were plenty around, but not in the school. So my position was semi-staff, semi-visitor, really. And I guess since I was a foreigner, I was also, well, on several occasions reminded that it could be difficult if I got into trouble, that I might be deported. Generally in a calm, polite, and even bantering sort of way. The French are very into banter, as you know. And so when I announced one day that I was going in to see what the demonstration was about, I got a lot of heckling about, well, be careful that the CRS don't catch you because you'll be back to England before you know where you are.
Did the school shut down during the events, or did it continue?
Well, that's a good question. The school didn't shut down. I mean, I was living in the school. I had a room and a kitchen, bedroom and a kitchen in there. That went on. Dinners went on. The students weren't sent home. I think it's probably true to say that classes were cancelled for part of the time. Probably the main impact was during the blockade of Caen. As you probably know, for 3 days at the end of May, the city was actually blockaded. There were roadblocks on the main entry and exit roads. So we wandered around, well, basically traffic-free Caen. Partly it was traffic-free because you couldn't get petrol anyway, but partly it was traffic-free because nobody could come or go. And I think during that period, the schools were shut. A lot of the shops were open on a restricted basis, and people were, well, petrol had already run out, essentially, but people were afraid that the cigarettes might run out and so on. And more seriously, food, although that wasn't a concern of mine because I was fed at the school. Yes, so the city certainly was closed for that period. I think a lot of the factories, well, pretty much all of the factories were shut. And a lot of the public services were shut. Certainly the post offices were closed. A lot of the stores were closed. And of course, a lot of the stores were closed in the centre of town because there were continual demonstrations and people were boarding up their windows and so on. It was slightly different. I mean, I was out in the suburbs, I suppose, about 20-minute walk from the centre, really, so not hugely far. But the life wasn't disrupted as much as that. The little local corner shops and bars and tabac and so on remained open, although there was a sort of more relaxed feeling about it because they didn't assume that you were a customer because you went into a shop. They assumed you might just be going in there for a chat, and going into the tobacconists. They'd say on a club, and then they'd pass the time of day with you. So it was fairly relaxed, and although the town was cut off, there was a sort of festival feeling about it. People couldn't quite believe they were doing it, and they probably didn't expect it to last. But it certainly was a hell of a gesture. And that all sort of, well, that was the peak, I think, really. From then on, well, obviously the Grenelle agreements were starting to be taken seriously and having an impact. And the workers were starting to go back. I think the decisive thing was the Whitsun break, Pentecote, for which the blockade of the town was removed, so people could go off on breaks to the coast or the countryside or wherever. And it's quite important in the school because a lot of the boys went back home to whichever part of the countryside they were in. They went home for the weekend. And I hung around in the school. I had nowhere else to go, really. And we went out on trips with some of the surveillants. And it was very relaxed. And when everybody came back, it was kind of it's all over, really. It was great fun while it lasted, and let's get back to something serious.
Just to pick up on a couple of things that you mentioned briefly there. You mentioned earlier about the contact between the workers and the students. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Yes.
Well, I can't elaborate very far because I didn't actually know any of the students who were working with the workers. But I did get reports from some of the surveillants or some of the older students that students were working with workers on the strikes in January, at the end of January, Saviem. I'd have to say that not many of the people that I knew of were involved at that stage. I did come across quite a few students later on who talked a lot about the workers, about the factories and needing to show solidarity with Saviem and all the others. But I didn't see it in action, and I don't recall seeing any workers' representatives actually in the university. University was a fairly hermetically sealed sort of place, really, from that point of view. And apart from the service staff at the university, I don't recall seeing any workers. Obviously, as I said earlier, I wasn't myself involved in any direct political party or movement or group, so I wasn't closely involved. It's what I picked up from the people around me that I can report on. I guess you'd say I was not terribly politicized, just kind of generally of the left.
And did you experience any of the occupation of the university? What was happening during this occupation?
Yes, I went up there one day to have a look round, and there were meetings, but I couldn't get into them. I mean, there were meetings in one or two of the amphitheatres, but they were crammed out, and it was kind of. It was as a visitor rather than as a student. I felt that I was there. I didn't. Some of the staff, the university, the porters and caterers and so on, were still there as far as I can remember. So they hadn't themselves gone on strike. But there was, apart from meetings, which weren't all the time. The rest of the time, it was a bit of a dead zone. Another day, I went in there, and there was nobody around really in the university. There were lots of people around in the bars and cafes, not very far away. But the university itself, I don't remember being particularly busy.
And the sort of stereotypical representation of the the way in which the students behaved or what they were interested in was that they were spending their time discussing how they were going to refaire le monde in some way or another. What was the tone of the discussions or the atmosphere at the time? Were they interested in reforming their university, or were they interested in a revolution?
I thought, well, the meetings and discussions that I was at were mainly revolutionary rather than reformist. People who spoke for reform on the whole got booed, I think. And there was a feeling really of in for a penny, in for a pound, that while we're at it, we may as well dismantle the whole show. Now, obviously, that's not what's happened, but I think that was the prevailing ethos. And I suppose I never thought this was particularly serious. There was a lot of shouting and a lot of arguments, but not much doing anything really about it. And I didn't, I mean, I thought there was a lot of people discovering ideas and trying them out for size rather than settled political intent. So although there was a lot of revolutionary talk, I think a lot of it was, as it were, exploratory. What would happen if we sacked the rector, turned the university into a student commune? And it tended to be a little bit different when staff were involved, and that wasn't very often. There were some university staff occasionally. They would be likely to be saying, well, it's a bit more complicated than you think, and you'd have to think about, well, who's actually going to pay for universities to run if it's not the state, and if you're running the university yourself, where are you going to get the wherewithal to pay teachers and so on. So there was quite a lot of students exploring ideas, a lot of, if you like, informal democracy. And of course, the teachers started to be tutored using the familiar form of address, which was quite new. French education was then and is now very hierarchical, and I guess before all those events, the hierarchy was extremely visible. During the events, people relaxed a bit and were prepared to be informal. Didn't abolish the hierarchies, but it did make people feel more comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, you touched earlier on your experiences of the tear gas and some police involvement. What were your impressions of the use of violence or the role of the police at the time?
It was interesting to see, and I'd kind of become used to the idea that if there was a strike, there'd be a demonstration, and if there was a demonstration, generally there'd be fighting, and the police were there. Obviously, the demonstrations had their own stewards, but there were always people there who wanted to fight, and generally the police were there and they would provide it. I don't think. I mean, the police had a reputation for being pretty tough, particularly the CRS, who were called out on a regular basis, and all sorts of rumours circulated about how they were kept in their vans from early morning without food and then unleashed on the students who they vented their spleen on. I obviously they were pelted with various things, all the way from ball bearings from the factories through to the pavé later on. Generally, there were figures of fear, although it was slightly. I got a slightly different perspective after the Whitsun holidays. A lot of people had been to the coast and swimming and so on, and of course the CNRS were on lifeguard duty there, so people had a sort of a two-edged view of the CRS. When they were all kitted up and helmeted, they were figures of terror. And obviously we got reports of what they'd been doing in Paris, although very confused and vague reports, I must say. And you wouldn't mess with them. But on the other hand, they were sort of respected, and they obviously had power. So to some extent, I normalised all this. And I thought, well, this is the way they do things in France. People have a bash and the police bash back, and then they all go away and it all settles down. And it was quite a contrast to my experience in England, really.
When you think back on it now, do you think back on it as a violent moment?
No, I don't. I mean, I look back on it more as a moment of ideas and exploration, and there was violence. Yes, of course there was, but that seemed, well, it sounds silly, but it did seem kind of normal to me, and I obviously it meant that you'd be nervous going into where all the action was happening. But I didn't feel that the period, I mean, say the period of the blockade, there was no violence really that I recall from that period. So there was a lot of non-violence, and a lot of times when the police stood back, let people get on, and generally, there was violence, but I don't remember that as the predominant impact.
You mentioned briefly there, and I was going to ask you about the influence of what was happening elsewhere, particularly in Paris. How much did that play on what was happening in Caen?
A certain amount, but not as much as retrospectively I would think. I mean, we got newspapers, which was the main source of information, but they on the hook often were late. They didn't always arrive. You couldn't get copies of them. The radio and television were very guarded about it all, so there wasn't much direct reporting. And anyway, I mean, television wasn't a big factor. It was there were only limited periods when the television was on, and in my position anyway, I only had limited access to the television whenever the school agreed to put it on, which was generally in the evening from 8 till 10. So that was my experience of the television. A lot of things went around by word of mouth, that people obviously got information over the telephone sometimes, from friends, or they'd met people. There wasn't a lot of travel. I mean, obviously during the high period of it all, you couldn't get petrol, so the idea of getting in a car and going to Paris was a bit unrealistic from Caen. And the trains, I think the trains were down for a good deal of that time as well. So it was a bit of the fog of war, really. You were aware that stuff was happening, but I suspect more of it appeared on BBC than ever did on the French media. And well, the telephone, I guess, was important. I didn't myself have a telephone, but people who did were often in touch with their friends in Paris. And of course, one of the features of occupations at that time was when you occupied some administration, you could use their telephones. So people who were occupying the Sorbonne or Nanterre or wherever were on the telephone most of the time to their friends, sometimes their friends in France, quite often their friends in America or Australia, because they weren't paying for any of the calls. So word of mouth was the way things got round. And I think most people were more concerned about the situation locally than they were about the national situation.
We were to extend that one step further then and talk about the importance of the international situation at the time, which is, as we know, is critically important in understanding the period. Was there any recognition of what was happening in France somehow fitted a more global European wave of protest?
I'd probably say not a lot. I think all the discussions I was involved in were very focused on France and the French situation, and occasionally I would chip into a discussion, with an English perspective, but what English perspective could I offer? I mean, my demonstrations were anti-apartheid and CND, which didn't concern the French in the least, to my perception. I mean, yes, people were sorry for the poor blacks in South Africa, but it wasn't their problem. And CND, well, didn't really feature in French discussions. So obviously there were some links with students from other countries, but not much really. There was some awareness. I mean, obviously there were international students there as well, and so there was some awareness that there were things happening in the rest of the world. But I lived it as a very Franco-French experience, I'd have to say. The international context, I mean, there's the lurking international context of Algeria, really, that was at the back of a lot of people's minds. And obviously, the OAS campaigns and assassination attempts and all the rest of it were very present. But that really only came up on the infamous disappearance of de Gaulle, where de Gaulle disappeared off, and it turned out he'd been to Baden-Baden and talked to Massu and so on. So the rumours went around that Paris was surrounded by tanks and that pretty soon Caen would be surrounded by tanks. And people did start to get a little bit worried that perhaps the state had means to do worse things than send in the CRS. And obviously the meeting with Massu brought back people's attitudes towards what had happened in the Algerian crisis. But no, I don't really recall big international contexts being invoked. When you start to talk to the left-wing parties, they would be talking about an international context, but it would be more likely to be kind of the Soviet Union in the 1920s, or perhaps China, but China wasn't really a feature at that stage. I know there were Maoist movements in Paris at that time, but I wasn't aware of any of them in Caen. So no, it was It was a local affair, largely, I think.
You've mentioned de Gaulle there, and you mentioned earlier how there was a sort of maybe an anti-de Gaulle sentiment amongst young people. What was your general impression of the way this was handled by the political elite at the time?
I think we felt that they were distant, not listening, and not interested in the sorts of things that were happening until, of course, all the strikes and demonstrations and so on shot into relief. And I think at that stage, de Gaulle seemed a very distant figure. I mean, obviously there were anti-Gaullist posters around. I think on the whole it was later rather than earlier, but had more focus. I know de Gaulle made television broadcasts, and they were kind of taken seriously, but that was from kind of on high, and I think he was seen as kind of the ultimate authority. Now, obviously, Pompidou was more familiar a figure, and he'd done a lot of the kind of spade work on the Grenelle Accords and all the rest of it. I mean, as Prime Minister, he would be very much the face of the government, really, whereas de Gaulle seemed somewhat remote, and people used to kind of speak of him sort of affectionately, Le Père de Gaulle, because he'd been around a long time. He was elderly. He was in his late 70s now at that stage. And I think a lot of people just felt he was a bit of a dinosaur. But clearly, when he went off and met Massu at that point, he then suddenly emerged as the embodiment of state power. And of course, that then triggered the Gaullist demonstrations, that a lot of people suddenly appeared on the streets who you hadn't suspected. And they were, in the bubble that I lived, you didn't really expect de Gaulle to have any supporters, but it then turned out that there were very large numbers of French people who were, for all sorts of reasons. And that, in a way, sort of came as a bit of a shock. I mean, I was used to de Gaulle being a sort of baddie figure, with ill will towards the new generation and inclined to use violence. But then meeting people who had followed de Gaulle over the Algerian situation, and even further back, their parents who had been Gaullist in the Second World War, that was kind of, that gave a lot of layers to de Gaulle. And in a way, a lot of the anti-de Gaulle things were more against the father figure. I mean, I think ultimately buy this, that de Gaulle was the kind of the father figure of France, and a lot of the protest against him was a protest really against the authority structures within France, which, you know, were embodied in families and schools. And I do think that it did lead to a movement of liberalisation of French life in all sorts of ways. And that's my abiding memory of it. I mean, obviously the political side and the student protests and the strikes and so on dragged on for a long time. I mean, I often went back to France during the 70s, and there was generally a helping of protests and strikes and so on. And I kind of got to feeling that, you know, really May 68 was spread quite thinly for the next 10 years or so. But the key thing that had happened, it had unlocked a whole flood of liberalisation, of a democratisation of attitudes, had changed the way that people relate to people in authority and responsibility. And I was quite struck by, at the school I was in, they put on a play every year, or they did at that stage. They put on an annual play. And the play they put on was a musical called Lycée Papillon, which you may or may not have heard of. It's kind of quite popular, sort of parody of school life. And I remember the director of the École Normale sitting there with his bow tie on, chuckling away and congratulating the students on their performance of Lycée Papillon. Now, there are all sorts of digs and snides and innuendos in it. I don't know whether he got any of it or not, but certainly the students were under the impression that they'd pulled one over him, that he hadn't noticed that he always wore a bow tie. So the Lycée Papillon was directed against his kind of authority. So and that was kind of the spirit of the time. And in a way, that most of that was put on by the senior students at the school, who were not themselves broadly involved in the politics directly, I think, but they were certainly part of, if you like, the cultural movement.
And when we get a sense towards the end, once we get the sort of the rise of the silent majority, and then we have the elections at the end of June, and it becomes clear that this moment is almost over, was there a sense of disappointment on your behalf, or was it a sense of relief?
Sense of retour à l'ordre, really. And I think from my point of view, it sort of finished at the Whitsuntide holiday, Pentecote, and everybody came back, and it was then a matter of sorting things out and getting things back to normal. And obviously, a lot of things had been disrupted, and there was, I mean, in my circles, there were questions of, well, would examinations take place at the end of the year? Would the baccalaureate be held? And lots of negotiations about how that happened. I was directly implicated because I was due to take exams in the second year of the licence, and they were postponed till the September. And I'd have to be honest and say I didn't bother coming back for the September exams, really. And there was a lot of question about whether people would just be let through with a pass. But that's kind of by way of saying that it was really a kind of a tidying up and getting things back into order process. I mean, obviously there were changes, and quite a few of the demands that's been made in education, if not in politics, were on the table, and there was a lot of lengthy negotiation, obviously, about that. So, yes, I think it was all over, essentially, by the end of the first week in June. And from then on, well, it was a little bit like a state of grace. Nothing was quite normal, but the storm had passed, really. I think I left in probably the third or fourth week of June. And it had been a wonderful experience, but it didn't seem to me, until retrospective, didn't seem to me particularly historic. It just seemed to me to be a really interesting foreign experience.
Yeah. And can you recall what your family or friends thought of your experience?
For
example, or
Yes, I think the when I got back to university in the final year, there was a lot of interest in talking about it, what had happened and why. And obviously, those of us who'd been there um, compared notes and talked a bit about it. And one of my friends had actually collected a whole dossier of every newspaper he could lay hands on for the duration of the period. Whereas, and I think another one had probably kept something of a diary, whereas the rest of us had just taken it in our stride and enjoyed that as part of French life. I think the effects of it were a bit longer term, though. I mean, it did have a radicalizing effect, and it did give more of a sense of what was possible in the political field. I guess the immediate impact probably was on university life, because a lot of the French university problems had their analogues in Britain. And I know at Warwick there were constant protests against the lack of social facilities and so on. And of course, at Warwick we had a sit-in subsequently, beginning of 1970. Well, that was with a year or two's lag. But I think a lot of people who'd been involved, including myself, started to take a more radical view of what could be done politically, and started looking for opportunities to apply that in our own context. I'd say that the year after I got back, things didn't radically change. I mean, there were still plenty of demonstrations over Vietnam and nuclear disarmament, and then ultimately against the Tories and so on. But I think it's only really a year or two later that the French experience started to be taken as any sort of a template for what could be achieved. And by that time, of course, lots of other countries were going up in smoke. The Prague Spring, the Italian hot summer, and so on. And I guess that's the time when people in France, or the political activists in France, started to take more of an interest in what was happening in other countries.
Yeah, that's correct. So you mentioned earlier on how you perceive some of the impact on France of the university. How would you summarize the impact more generally then? So sort of beyond the university world.
I think the impact in France, well, as I suggested, protest and strikes and confrontation with the police and so on became a normal part of life, I'd say, for the next 10 years, probably. And on a wider basis, it became a kind of a model or a template for other European countries, particularly, I think, the junction between workers and students was identified as being a major political issue, and opening up possibilities. I think this was a time when students were starting to emerge as another social category outside the traditional kind of class structures that students were a factor, a little bit like, well, this is sort of pre-women's movement largely, but the idea of students as a political force alongside various other social groups started to become more widely recognised. Now, and I know this linked up with a lot of what was going on in America as well at the same time, where the American student body was much more politicised by the Vietnam War, obviously, than in Britain. But I remember reading quite a bit of kind of radical literature on the new political status of students. I think the impact on social attitudes was not so great. I think to a large extent, France was following the same sort of liberalisation of social attitudes as the rest of Western Europe, and it did then start to raise questions like feminism. Once you start to open up authority structures and challenge them, well, there are lots of them there, and I think probably the gender authority structures were the clearest and the ones which were opened up most energetically after May 68, although May 68 hadn't really involved gender issues to any degree that I could detect. I know afterwards a lot of militant female students complained about being assigned subaltern roles of making the coffee for the revolutionary men, and that may be true. But I can certainly say that I do think May 68 was a largely male thing in my experience, but that might be just from where I was in an all-boys school. And although I knew female students who were on my course, I don't really recollect any of them being involved in political activity. It was generally the men.
Did May 68 change your understanding of France?
It did, in that before May 68, my understanding of France was a largely cultural one. It was a stable country which produced fabulous culture, novels, poetry, films, etc. After 68, I started to understand if you like, the social structures behind the culture a lot more. And I took a lot more interest in the way that was expressed politically. So I guess I would say it changed my perspective from that point of view, that my appreciation of culture became much more political, social and political, I guess. That I no longer saw culture as an autonomous domain which you just got on and enjoyed, but as something which was kind of deeply attached to everything else in society, and in particular the structures of money and power and ownership and the ways in which this could be contested essentially by organisation and education, and perhaps by agitation too. Because one thing I did see was that once political activism started to happen, people's interest in politics rocketed, and they became much more intensely concerned with finding their own analysis, arguing with other people. So there is a kind of what we would later have called conscientization that happened. And it was a little bit like waking from a rather sleepy time. And I mean, in a way, it's unfair to the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But as a 20-year-old in France, well, it was all new, and it was like a wake-up call.
Do you think that that experience had any impact on your scholarship on France? What you would do in terms of your research or interest?
Oh, yes. Well, certainly it did. Well, my scholarship, it certainly had an impact on my scholarship of France. I moved from a more abstract interest in philosophy and literature towards an attempt to understand the connections between ideas and society. And I spent, I guess, quite a bit of the next part of my career looking at ideologies in terms of beliefs in a socially situated context, why they emerged. I did a lot of work on the Catholic left. My doctoral thesis was on Emmanuel Mounier, who was not a big feature in 1968, I'd have to say. Mind you, he had died in 1950, but obviously Sartre was a big and influential figure in all that. But then I went on, I didn't actually do my thesis on Sartre. I liked Mounier's approach to political commitment. And then I went on to look in more depth at French Marxism, Marxist approaches. And I guess between Marxism and religion, that's been quite the focus of my subsequent interest in France. So I've done a lot of work on the politics of culture and politics of philosophy and literature and so on. Not so much, I mean, I've taught French politics, read in tooth and claw, at undergraduate level. But my research was not on political science, if you like, at what I would call cultural studies, which really to me encapsulates the relationship between all the cultural phenomena and the socio-political dimension. Ultimately the economic, I guess, as well.
Would you say that 68 had an impact on you personally?
Oh, yes. It certainly had an impact on me personally. I think I came back feeling that I needed to challenge more things around me. Not necessarily by violence, but by challenging things. And certainly when the student protests started in Warwick in 1970, I was very much part of that. And I think from that period on, well, I canvassed for the Labour Party in 1970, but I think it's probably true to say that I moved a good deal further left than that over the next few years. And obviously I did a lot of work on French Marxism, well, and on Marxism tout court, for that matter. And I think that wouldn't have happened without May 68. It's a kind of feeling that I have that the world can always change. And it's not the whole of the world. And you hope it's changed for the better. And my perception of May 68 was that it did change the world for better. I think France was a better place after it, a freer, more open place, more exciting and creative. I think it got very boring and stodgy. But that these things don't necessarily happen organically. They happen because something sparks a movement. And I guess, if you want to, it's learning from a crisis is part of it. That you don't necessarily expect all these things that happen, but you've got to think about them, work out why they happen, and what you can learn from that. It's not easy, I mean, because it's comfortable to be comfortable, but it's more exciting to be challenged and to have to rethink. And I guess in the current situation in the UK, I'm having plenty of opportunities to do that.
So as someone who not only experienced these events, but has obviously got a keen interest in France over the years, you will have kept an eye on the way in which the story of 1968 has been told. And I wondered if you had an opinion on whether or not the dominant perspective on these events encapsulates or captures really your experience of these events.
I think the dominance, well, the first thing I'd say, it's I was there in the kind of fog that I've mentioned to you. So at that time, it was by no means clear to me what was happening. And I think that would be true of an awful lot of people, French people there as well, that they chipped in because something was happening and they kind of felt they'd go along with it. Subsequent, and the scholarship on May 68 has largely been about the elite activists, the movements, the political parties, and I think that's given a sense of greater clarity, but doesn't correspond to my experience. I think it ends up by suggesting that there are simple explanations for what happened, and that what the SNES soup did in early May would be decisive on events and so on. I think a lot of the elite activists were really bit players in a more general roustabout, which lots of people participated in because they obscurely thought this was the right thing to do. And I think obscurely, to me, summarizes it. I think trying to boil it down and understand precisely what happened is probably a mistake. Well, not a mistake. It's never a mistake to try and understand things. But to feel that you can boil it down to a few key factors or a few key players, I think is where I would disagree. I think a lot of the history of it has been dominated by people who were there and involved, or people who would like to have been there and involved. And I don't see a lot of analysis from a more dispassionate point of view. I mean, it takes time for history to become history, I guess. And I think how would I put this? This year is probably going to be the last real autobiographical commemoration of May 68, because people who were there and doing anything very much are hitting 70 now, and the next 10-year anniversary they're going to be in their 80s, and a lot fewer of them around. So I think it will clear the way for a next generation of historians to try and do a more objective job on understanding May 68, if that's what they want to do.
Is it a necessary job to do you think?
A necessary job?
Do we need to do it? Do we need to do that?
I don't think so, actually. I think it's 50 years ago. An awful lot has changed since then. I don't think that it tells us as much about France as a lot of other events. The precise what we can learn from it for today is, I think, really quite limited. To take two examples, the student movement, well, there isn't one. The labour movement is in quite a different place from where it was in 1968. I think a big thing that's changed since then is the huge availability of media, and if you like, the cultural domain in which we all live. In 1968, it was much more homogeneous. I think it's now so heterogeneous that there is not a lot to be learned from what happened in May 68. I guess I've not myself made a practice of turning up for anniversaries of May 68 and writing much about it, partly because I don't think it's the most important thing that happened even during that period. And in a lot of ways, the real May 68 wasn't really worked out until the 1970s. And it was a kind of flashpoint, but it was an opportunity for people to do things and change things, which they subsequently did. And I'm not convinced that all the subsequent changes are implicit in the events of May 68 themselves.
I see. I understand. I'm going to ask you one more thing before I let you go. If you had 30 seconds to sum up your experience of May 68, how would you do it?
I'd say it was an exciting time when the world seemed to be changing. It didn't change as much as we thought it was, and we didn't necessarily know what was going on, but we knew something was going on. And it really provided a spark for a lot of things that came after it in France and probably more widely as well. I think the French model was looked at very, very widely, and I think informed a lot of what happened over the next couple of decades in the rest of Western Europe.